Hello. The 2026 Civil Service Mains Examinations General Essay paper is just over. So, yet again we have another set of 8 interesting questions in this paper. So, let's see the questions. The first question from section A is oxymorons reflects the ironies of life. Now, a warning, if you don't understand oxymorons, obviously don't think about taking this one. Oxymorons are certain figure of speech where we put two opposites together, like deafening silence and bittersweet. Now the statement says that oxymorons reflects the ironies of life. Now the meaning of the statement would be like in life sometimes there are at a time many things may happen which seems to be totally opposing to each other. Say for example, think about the statement called deafening silence. It's so silent, but you feel that it is something which is able to deafen you, something which is able to shut down your ears. So that's a figure of speech, that's a state of mind, that's a situation which you feel. So in life, many a time such situations can happen, and the experience, if you say bittersweet, it may be at the same time good as well as bad. So all these things can be put together to write this essay. But to come up with enough such words and developing them into a 1000-word essay is going to be really challenging, because you may be just able to recall some 2-3 such oxymoron words, so that may not be enough. So I would say that you better avoid this one. Let's move on to the next one. A grateful mind is very beautiful. Now, that's a bit more easy to attempt. Grateful mind means a mind which shows, which is being thankful, which is being grateful for all the blessings. That is a beautiful mind. Now, almost all the religions actually talk about this. Religion generally, and not only I'm talking about the religious texts, but all the stories of morals and values actually reflects these sentiments. For all the blessings you receive, you should be thankful. And there are counterpoints, there are examples of people who showed arrogance and how that's going to be negatively affecting them in the long run. All those examples you could bring. So start with a very good, a catchy example from any of these fables or stories where that gratefulness, that being humble, that ultimately, how beautiful that could be. So you need to start with such an example of humility. Then explain this, proceed with the rest of the examples. And as always, I would recommend that you write it topic wise and chronologically. Topic wise in the sense, examples of such humility from different walks of life, public life, and people often talk about our former President APJ Abdul Kalam as he always show that gratefulness and that ignited mind is a very beautiful mind. So you could even start with an example of him to begin with. So the whole thing about gratefulness, if you take some time to plan, this is attemptable. After all, the meaning of the essay is not very confusing. Third question from section A is, a thorn is a changed bud. So, a thorn and a bud. People often say that in a rose plant you see both thorns and buds. But here in this statement it is said that a thorn is a changed bud. That means here thorn represents something bad and bud represents something good, and here it states that they both are two sides of the same coin. So overall this statement is all about, we can't be sure about, absolutely sure about what is good or what is bad. There is always a shade of grey, and there is always a possibility that a good thing can become bad or a bad thing can become good. So, I just thought about a very interesting story. Not a story, a real thing. When Leonardo da Vinci painted the Last Supper, he had this one person modeled for Jesus. But he finished that, but then he was searching for different people as models for the 12 disciples. But he never got anybody to, represent Judas. So it got postponed. In the end, he ended up finding a prisoner for the role of Judas, who had that despair in his face. But when he started painting, the prisoner started crying, and he told that it was he only who actually modeled for Jesus. Later, he got into some trouble and he ended up in the prison, and his face changed so drastically. So, this is an interesting example which you could use here. So, examples of things where you cannot be absolutely sure about good or bad, and how good can change into bad and bad can change into good. You could write about, Angulimala, the thief who became a Buddhist monk, or Valmiki who was a robber later becoming a saint. All those things you could say, and the other way also, how a good person can become bad. All those things, if you could jot down, this question is also attemptable. Because again, it's depending upon how rich you bring the examples. The last one from section A is, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. So, what is the meaning of this topic? When two powerful beings are fighting each other, it is the weaker ones who get in between who will get crushed. In fact, there is a similar, a story of the two wolves and, the goat, and how when, the wolves were fighting, and the goats got in between and they got crushed. So such kind of stories, especially the Aesop fables and other things, are full of such stories. So you could, since the question has this word elephant, you could bring in something from the animal world, some this small stories, or you could develop it into international relations when the war between US and Iran, and how it is being affected, how it is affecting all the other smaller countries in between. So, any of this ancient fable about some animals, or the present situation of the war, any of this you could write as a starting point, then explain the whole thing. Then you could you put it as how this statement is not about two animals fighting, how it can be brought into the larger segment of real wars and international relations. Then historically you bring in such examples, how the small beings got trampled when big powers were fighting. You could write about the Cold War era and things like that. Okay, that's about section A. And I would say that of all these things, I think the last one is much more attemptable, because this can be easily applied to the international relations scenario, etc. The first question is the toughest one. The second and third ones I would say are attemptable provided that you are able to remember enough examples. Fourth one, as I said, since the mighty fights and the weaker got crushed, that is much more easily attributable to different situations. So my pick is the question number 4. Now let's move on to section B. Nature is the symbol of the spirit. Now that's a very Indian way of looking into spirituality, because Indian spirituality is very closely connected to nature. That supreme being, as we call it, is very closely connected to nature. In fact, Indian philosophy and even religion originated from nature worship itself. We as a country worship our rivers. We always say Ganga Mata, and we worship our mountains and every natural beings. We worship fire, water, air, everything. So you have to bring in all these elements of how the spirit and that spiritual aspect and nature is together. So majority of your essay will be covering the Indian way of life. But it's not only India, but other countries also you could find out certain examples. So the thing is, the spirit or the Atma, as you call it, that is, the nature around us, our environment and the things around us, they actually symbolizes this thing. In simpler words, nature is God. So write about all this nature worship and write about how nature behaves, and people often says that whenever there is a natural calamity, it is like and whenever a flood or a landslide, people say that nature is taking revenge for us, against us for treating it very bad. All those examples, write about all the information you have in your environmental studies, you can bring in here and add to that a little bit of philosophy, and how we treat all these, as I said, Ganga Mata and things like that. Any of that you could start as an example. Then bring it all those things, and how the Chipko movement, how people were hugging the trees to protect them. All elements you can bring in. So if you take a little bit of time, this one is quite attemptable because you study a lot of environmental aspects as well. But mere environment is not enough. You have to bring in the philosophical aspects behind it. Now, the next question from section B. A well-educated mind will always have more questions than answers. So, UPSC asked similar kind of questions. A man of science is always have doubts. That was a question some years ago. So, an educated mind is always have more questions than answers. That means an educated mind is a mind with curiosity and a mind which does not accept things so blindly. So, the meaning is pretty understandable. Now, you have to bring in people of science who changed the existing ways of life, and be it people who brought path-breaking discoveries, people who changed the course of course of history. You could write about people like Copernicus, Galileo, then from other biological science who questioned the existing norms, all of them. And a person who is extremely sure about everything, that is not a sign of education. So education should ultimately help you to question. And you could actually even start with the Gen Z protests, like all these kids who are just students who are writing for the exam, and but when there is an issue, when there is a system failure, they came out and protested. They asked questions. That Gen Z protest itself you could put as a starting point, because they were also asking questions. And apart from all these people who, men of science, you could generally mention about the system of education and how our system suppress people who ask questions and how that need to be changed, all those things. And I mentioned Gen Z here, but even a better example is a story of Nachiketa, who asked lot of questions even to Yama. So if you know the story of Nachiketa, one who asked so many questions, that could be the best starting point for this one. So if you have an understanding about education and about science in general, this question is quite attemptable. Now let's move on to the next one. Shelving hard decisions is the least ethical course. Now that could be a very well question for your ethics paper as well. If you postpone a decision which is hard to take, that is least ethical. So this term has a lot of relevance in administration and politics. If you postpone something which is actually hard, that is not at all a good thing to do, because it's especially when it comes to politics and administration, it's a question of justice. And we always say justice delayed is justice denied. So, but of course, when you take a decision, there will be repercussions, there will be accusations, everything. But you should be in a position to take them. So, we could take up examples from the field of armed forces, politics or administration. Maybe, how our leaders were taking hard decisions, and say for example India's Pokhran nuclear tests, which was a hard decision to take, but our leaders went on and took them. Or you could, ideally you should start with a positive example of a timely decision, but since this question is about the least ethical thing is being emphasized, how a delay in implementing something caused, destruction and loss of life, you could put that as a starting point. Maybe, hijacking situation and the government is postponing that decision of releasing the terrorists or negotiating or military action. They are confused and delayed, and that delay tactics may be causing life. Something like that also you could start with. That may be even better in a way, because shelving hard decision is least ethical. That is the thing. So even for ethical reasons, you just can't postpone things. That is the thing. So if you are familiar with the public administration thing, or your ethics paper revision has been pretty good, go for this. Because the meaning is quite simple. How rich examples you will bring in makes all the difference. And the last one for 2026 general essay paper. A good leader is the one who follows the followers. So, leadership, there are different types. Leading from the front is one such thing. But in a democracy, ideally, a leader should listen to his followers. So, you could start with an example. Somebody who understands the pulse of people and take decisions accordingly. You could start with even some kings who, roam around among the people in disguise and understand their pulse and take decisions. Akbar and Birbal used to do such things, as it's been heard. So you could start with something simple as that, and then in a democracy, how the collective decision making, how listening to your followers are important, you can bring in all the examples. Again, you can bring in the Gen Z protest as an example, because there, you are listening to the larger demands of the public and you are trying to act accordingly. So, and you could bring all the other administrative things, the right to information, and now the government is, whenever there is a bill or a draft is ready, they put it in the public domain, asking people to comment on it. That's a pretty democratic way of doing it. So that also you can bring in. So section B, you could see that there are questions where decision making and this administration points can be brought in. Section B, I would say all the 4 answers are attemptable. First one about nature and spirit, environment and spirituality. If you have knowledge, you can go for that. Educated mind and question, UPSC has asked similar questions, so if you are prepared for that, you can go for that. The third question about the decision making and the fourth question about leadership are both attemptable because you could bring in all your GS information. So I hope the people who have wrote this made a wise choice and made the best use of the questions available, and others who are preparing for next year, make your good choice and try framing it. If you, all of you can just put this with the help of AI and get what all the points are required, and then all of you can write your own answers. The best thing to do is to write in your own style and start with not so cliched examples. All the best and thank you for watching.